Sheila and I met when we held a conference recently with ALT, the Association for Learning Technologists, and Sheila did the keynote for that. And Sheila, I was really interested in how you started your keynote. You talked about radical uncertainty. And the title of our conversation now is kind of like, sort of like future now for digital and learning. But I thought that was a good way of thinking about it, that actually, we've been living through uncertainty. There's more uncertainty to come. Do you want to just kick us off by kind of what your thoughts were behind that?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thanks for that, Sarah. Yes, so I think that's a good place to start, because that conference again was about the future of digital learning and teaching. And just reflecting on the past year, as you said, there has been so much uncertainty, and we've all had to do quite radical things. And that could be radical in a small sense of being radical, or radical in actually doing something that's completely different and is actually pushing the boundaries. So I think there is a danger now as we get closer to, Caitlin's in the office today. I don't know how many other people that are here today or watching the recording will have actually been back to their place of work. But I think there's an eagerness to get back to, I'm going to use the famous air quotes here, normal. And actually we might there might be a danger of us forgetting all the good things that we have done with technology, and maybe going back a little bit, instead of trying to embrace some of the things that we've done and trying to make them really part and part of our everyday practice. And the notion of radical uncertainty actually came from a paper I read about climate change, because obviously that's another big challenge for us all. But there is uncertainty. We know that many bad things are happening, and some other very bad things will happen, but we're quite uncertain about when that's going to happen. And we maybe need to embrace those things so we can all feel empowered to do something around about it. So just kind of thinking about maybe trying to embrace that idea of being radical, of doing things differently, and try to mainstream things that weren't mainstream a year ago, but actually are now, and see how we can actually use the experiences that we've had over the past year in a positive way. So I think that's where I was coming from with that.
And I think educators as a whole, we're all kind of reflecting, aren't we, at this stage, about what we've learnt, what we're going to take forward into the future. And we did an exercise at that conference, and it's an activity that we've used quite a lot with teachers over the past few months. So we did a Padlet, and it's this idea of kind of like, from the last year, what are the things that you kind of want to put in the shredder, kind of like, just you tried something and you're not going to do it again. What's in the shop window? What are you really proud of? And has worked well. What's in the greenhouse? I think maybe that's the bit that we're really interested in this conversation, kind of what's got potential and what can you develop. And then we had the pantry, which is like your staples, that you might have your kind of your good solid learning platform that's now absolutely tried and tested. And then the museum, what was kind of good for the time, but actually we're going to move on from that. And some really interesting things have come from teachers and educators through those prompts. And thinking about what we really want to take forward, what's in the greenhouse, what are we going to develop, how are we going to do things like feedback and engagement and collaboration and group work differently, because students, teachers have all been using digital tools as a kind of norm during remote teaching. Sheila, I don't know what you took from that exercise.
Yeah, I think, just on reflection, it was a really interesting set of opinions and I suppose actual practices that came out of that. And I think it's very good to make time to do that, because I think one of the things that we talked about then, and I'm talking about with a lot of people just now, is actually teachers haven't had a rest. Everyone has been working full on for the last year. And even when there have been holidays, there's been a lot of uncertainty about what we're going back to when the new term starts, particularly after Christmas. So I think we've maybe not, people are trying to make time to reflect, but it's very, very difficult in all sectors. I think it's particularly difficult in the school sector. There's so many competing and additional challenges being thrown into that mix. But making time for reflection and actually doing something quite structured, but you can do quite quickly, I think would be a really good kind of staff development activity, or maybe a year group teachers or even teaching teams to try and do that, to really consolidate what's happened. And also, I think in terms of moving forward, it's a really useful way to start thinking about how we're going to support each other as well, support our colleagues, look for CPD courses, when we maybe want and need to interact with organisations like TechPathways, what do we need? So yes, I think it is good to reflect on that, because I think one of my biggest fears is that, as I sort of alluded to earlier, is that we're just going to revert back to normal, or so-called normal. And I think that would be shortchanging everyone in some ways. But there are some really, really big challenges that everyone has faced around education, around technology, and having access to devices, having access to data, having space to work. So trying to take some of those lessons and see how we can be as flexible as possible. So if we did at maybe a day's or a week notice have to go into a very short lockdown, that our students would know what they were supposed to be doing for the rest of the week, and there wouldn't be a mad panic again. I don't know if that's actually possible, but I think kind of thinking about those things, but I think we do need to try and carve out some time to have these conversations. And also some of the issues we were talking about this morning, particularly about ICT and gender, and actually changing our curriculum so we can have these really grounded conversations. One of the things that I talked about in my keynote at that last conference was the notion of public pedagogy, and actually bringing in more real world context to what we're doing. And I think we need to start that as with children as young as possible in context as well. There are some really big challenges. So how can we as educators, and how can our schools and our colleges and our universities, which are very digitally rich spaces, how can they best be utilised when we can't get into those spaces, or as we slowly get back into these spaces? So there are big conversations that need to be had, and I think that can come from the bottom up as well, particularly if we start thinking about gender as well, and some of those bigger issues.
So you've covered lots of things there, lots of things I want to sort of pick up on, Sheila. So firstly, the whole question around professional development and kind of communities of practice and teachers reflecting together, because I think that's probably one of the things that that will absolutely stick, is that sessions like this, we're all now used to professional development that's virtual, and within schools as well, using time in a different way, but also connecting out. So I think one of the things that we've really been sort of delighted to kind of be able to facilitate and be part of is bringing teachers together from across different schools to have those moments of reflection and to learn together. So I think that's something that's going to change, like how we learn as teachers, how we reflect as teachers. But I think you're right, it does need that structure. So it is kind of events like this, and also at the local level. Then I think you mentioned the digital divide, and I think that's absolutely kind of crying out, isn't it? It's a kind of the issue that needs addressing. We haven't done enough within the last 10 years. We've been talking about the digital divide since the 90s, and we certainly haven't done enough in the last year, but it's got to be addressed nationally. It's got to be addressed globally. So I think in terms of talking about the future of digital, we really have to look at that, and then within that, I was to say it's not just about the access and the connectivity, it's also about the skills and the digital skills. and that was actually something we had a bit of a chat yesterday in preparation for today, and that was something we were talking about as well, wasn't it? Of kind of that actually young people's digital skills, as we know from the kind of, you know, the TechPathways program and what the digital talent program is doing, we know that actually we make assumptions about young people being digitally skilled when they're not. And if you're disadvantaged, you're likely to be kind of doubly disadvantaged by having low digital skills.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that came through quite strongly this morning in the first presentation, the first discussion we had this morning as well. You know, and there was reference to the report about, you know, the lack of ICT skills in sort of school leavers. But I think there's some of those wider issues about how we embed and how we understand and how we talk about digital capabilities, digital literacies, ICT skills. Again, there's that language problem about what we're talking about. And there's actually no area of the curriculum where you don't really need to have, or it isn't advantageous to have digital skills. And, you know, where you can bring in maybe some of the, I suppose, the more traditionally thought of IT skills like programming, but they can be very relevant in the arts across social sciences as well as maths and science and engineering. So I think it's how we actually do that. And really have, again, I guess this goes back to some radical thinking about really radically rethinking our curriculum. Our curriculums just now, particularly in schools, are very packed. And I think it's always very difficult to do a review of a curriculum, but I think actually this could be a very timely point to do it, because if now isn't a good time to really radically think about how we change things, and I really don't know when is, because everyone has gone through such transformation and such a communally shared experience. Obviously, it's been slightly different in your own context, but everyone has gone through this and realizes that there have been impacts. So I think this would be a good time to look at it and start to see how we can, again, maybe at kind of bottom up and government level as well. So actually get this kind of move away from, yes, you've got to have these ICT programming skills and you have to do a traditional IT subject to do that. It's how we maybe embed that and recognize those very important skills of communication and working together, which actually that's what employers want as well. And we've had to look at that over the last year really seriously. How do we do that? How can we actually get a class working? How can we get a class of 6-year-olds working online? Oh, you know, I'm in awe of teachers who've been doing that. But equally, when you get to college and university students, how can you make sure that they are confident enough to be able to communicate and have some agency around where they're working and the types of technologies that they want to use, be aware of data and some of the legal implications that we were talking about as well. There's a whole load of things that we need to think about. And I think we need to modernise, particularly some of our maybe sort of senior governmental thinking around about what's really important. Just now, it's not just about being able to program. That's part of it.
Yeah.
But it's who's doing the programming. You know, there's a lot of emphasis just now from our current UK government on technology and artificial intelligence. But we need to start having conversations about who is writing the algorithms just now. You know, what is the gender and ethnic balance of that? What are the technologies that we're actually putting into schools? Are they actually caring? Are they safe? Are they equitable? Are they accessible? So there are some big questions that need to be addressed from sort of bottom and top up, but and top down. Sorry. So yes, there's lots of things that need to be considered, and I do have a slight worry that maybe there might be a rash of very quick decisions made that maybe are not involving everybody in the conversation. So I think trying to have wider conversations and sharing practice, which is always difficult, but I think we really need to do that. And events like this are a way where we can do that, and trying to keep these conversations going across sectors as well, and not be as siloed within education that we sometimes can be.
And it's so broad, isn't it, with digital? I'm just thinking about, you know, that perhaps maybe particularly now when we've been using digital as the kind of medium for learning, that people might think that means that everyone's adept with digital, but it's so much more than that. And I think, you know, being creative with digital and learning to use technology and learning how it works, and you know, the real breadth, as you say, kind of, you know, and that we don't just get sort of stuck in the kind of a narrow STEM view of digital as well.
Absolutely. I think, oh, sorry, Sarah.
So I was just going to say, also pick up just about the kind of ethics of AI. I know that yesterday the University of Buckinghamshire produced a new ethical framework for AI in education that Rose Luckin was part of. So I think that kind of thing will be helpful to have a kind of a standard. I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know ALT, the Association for Learning Technology, they're developing an ethical framework for learning technology as well, which will be, you know, anyone can get involved with that, but that will be published, I think, later this year. So yes, kind of thinking about those sort of practical implementation steps as well. But yes, I think that's good. The other thing I was just going to say before that, you know, in terms of what you were saying about, you know, we're used to communicating and doing things digitally. One of the things that I found over the past year is actually it's kind of reignited my joy of the physical as well, if you like. So when I am doing something online, I'm writing much more. I'm scribbling. I'm taking notes, and you know, not everything has to be done on a device. And I think actually, in terms of education, actually having that. I think that helps with creativity as well, but making something a bit more meaningful if you have an actual physical artifact. It kind of helps you, I suppose, contextualize your learning experience as well. And some of the things that Caitlin was talking about just before lunch in her fantastic session about filmmaking, you're using stop motion videos, doing filmmaking, looking at things around you, and that kind of mix of the physical and the digital as well. I think that's really important. So I think, you know, because we're doing things more online, it doesn't mean to say that pens and papers and other older technologies don't have a place in our life anymore, because they have a really important place, and being able to share those things that we're doing. And I guess that's sort of a wider thing that's happened during lockdown with people, you know, all of a sudden finding creative outlets. You know, they're baking, they're cooking, they're sewing, they're knitting, they're painting, or whatever. And I think that's quite, you know, that's really positive, and trying to bring that into education as well would be really positive. And I know many people do that, but I think sometimes we just think you're at a screen and you can't do anything else. You just have to type all the time.
I've seen some lovely things that teachers have done, kind of creating their own visualizers, you know, that actually they've been saying that seeing the physical, so actually seeing the teacher handwriting on paper, has been really important in the remote teaching, and you know, little rigs with their phone if they haven't been able to have a visualizer at home. And then also in the kind, as you say, in the planning, kind of making sure that students are going away from the screen and they're doing something physical. We've got some questions coming through. So there's a question from Richard about bring your own device scheme, and how can we provide digital literacy skills to pupils who do not have a computer or a phone. I mean, I think, you know, that is, it is absolutely massive, and it's been really interesting to see actually how different countries have tackled this. So I was reading that in Korea, for example, they identified very specifically 223,000 young people who didn't have access to devices, and then they made sure that all of those 223,000 young people had connectivity and access. So, you know, it's like the Carnegie Trust says, it's kind of, there are these different levels. We need to do something at the school level and the teacher level, class level, to support those families, but there does need to be something at kind of policy level and national level. Sheila, I don't know if you've got any kind of like specific.
Yeah, I think you know, I think a lot of schools have been really thinking about this more seriously over the past year. They've had to do that. I know there have been various issues around about actually just schools getting the equipment that then they can loan out to pupils as well. There are quite a few framework. Because I've got an HE background, I'm sort of more familiar with bring your own devices in that context. What we did at my previous university, and I know this is quite common, we had a laptop borrowing scheme that was based in the library, so students could just go in and they could borrow a laptop for an hour or a day or two or whatever. So it's maybe that kind of idea. I think though, in terms of at school education, where I think it's much more critical about that equitable access to technology, I think that goes back to the design of the activities that you're getting your children, you want your children to engage in, your pupils to engage with as well. So I think there has to be some really careful consideration about what's going to be done when, and trying as much as possible not to disadvantage people who don't have access at home. So, you know, there's different levels there. It's actually finding out who has access, and, you know, how do you do that in an equitable and a fair way, and also a way that doesn't make people feel that, oh gosh, I don't have anything, I'm different to somebody else. So you have to think about that. Sorry, I'm not going to give any solutions here, but I think it comes back, you know, back to think, right, what have we got in school, and how can we develop the core skills that we want in terms of what we're actually doing in this particular activity. So I think it's quite a holistic view that you have to take of that. And also, I guess thinking about some of these higher order skills as well, it's actually planning. So maybe it's more project and collaborative based learning that you're doing, that actually you don't always have to be on the computer. Actually might be that maybe when you're in school you're doing things, but there's some group work, or there's things that school children can do when they're not at school that doesn't rely on them being on a computer. And maybe, you know, kind of again, that just write down some things on a bit of paper, some notes, 5 things. Those some simple things, but I think it really is about thinking about how you can be as equitable as possible. But also we have to be realistic, and a lot of it comes down to money and finance and where you can actually get these machines.
Yeah. And it's also, I mean, just picking up other kind of like the learning design aspect, it's kind of designing for low bandwidth. So it's really making sure that you're thinking about how you're presenting materials and what, you know, your learning platform does, and you know, are you using things like Zoom at high bandwidth? I mean, obviously there's the government scheme. I think it's about kind of leveraging every bit of funding you can get as a school leader, isn't it? So it's sort of, you know, some business funding, some charitable funding, how you can match that with the government DFE scheme. And I know lots of schools are putting significant amounts of their own budgets, and, you know, doing things like having kind of, you know, Chromebooks for everyone. So I think there are different solutions. No, we're coming towards the end, but I just want to pick up on also on Jenny's question about kind of how can we kind of keep moving things forward rather than falling back. And I think that's a really good question, because we have all learnt so much. Practice has changed. I think that we've, you know, teachers have had to be really explicit actually in their teaching in the remote context, and breaking it down into its kind of constituent parts. I think conversations are happening all over the country, all over the world, in staff rooms and virtual staff rooms, about how schools are going to change. I was talking to a head teacher this morning who was saying that at their school they've got sort of small working groups, and they're looking at things like, you know, how are they approaching feedback and engagement and collaboration, and they want to keep some of the ways that they've been doing that in the distance learning, in the online learning. They want to kind of bring that back into the classroom. So I think having that kind of you know, bring it into the kind of digital strategy and the school development plan, thinking about what's worked well, what people want to continue with, and what sort of makes sense pedagogically for the blend that's going to be using digital, being face to face.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just looking at Jenny's question there as well about, you know, going for, you know, the end of that question and about project-based learning. I think, yes, that is a really good way to move forward. And I think schools are very good at doing that already. So I think the more that we can do of that, the better. But just at the end there, Richard's actually gone back to the lack of IT skills there, and asking which are a source of concern, and which ones do you think we should prioritize? I didn't actually, I just read the news reports. I haven't actually read the actual report there. For me though, I think it's some of the, I think it's a mix of those kind of softer communication skills, but making sure that everyone is confident enough to do things like this, to be on a Zoom call, to actually how many times I have left my mic on mute in the last year. I've given up counting, but having the confidence that actually doesn't matter. But thinking about being able to email, some kind of appropriate ways to communicate in terms of how do you communicate at a business level. It's not like sending a WhatsApp or doing a message to your friends, that kind of language. Again, it goes back to language. So I think there's some skills there that are, we sometimes, I think we can assume that everyone knows how to do that. And I think we've probably all suffered from miscommunication in our working life, just because someone hasn't thought about the tone of their email. So I think there's some of those skills that we need to be thinking a bit more about as well as actually, does it matter whether you're using Office 365 or Google Mail or whatever? At least you can actually, I know this is an email system. I know that how to send, how to receive, how to file, how to manage information. Those kind of, I suppose, kind of basic skills are probably really important. And then it will depend on what industry you want to go into. So, if there's a lot of job opportunities just now in the financial sector. So maybe it is more of these kind of Excel skills. It will depend on context. Sorry, Sarah, do you want to?
And I was just going to say that I think there's also something about using, because young people are mostly probably using mobile devices, so it's actually learning the skills of using a desktop. So it's kind of whatever it is you're doing, that you're kind of doing it at a higher level. So if you're doing filmmaking and editing, or if you're doing sort of photographic editing or graphic design or programming or whatever it is, that you can kind of take it to its sort of higher skill level. So I think we're talking about kind of devices at home, but I think there is also a real place for having, like good desktop computers that young people can use, and that they can, develop those skills. And certainly with the younger children, it's kind of making sure that right from when they're really little, that they understand about things like kind of folders and saving and some of those real basic things, and that then we're building on that as we go through.
It's almost like an IT grammar, isn't it? It's a level of understanding of that kind of. I don't know if that's a very good analogy, but I think that's as that develops, things like accessibility, like how knowing how to make a document accessible for people, that's going to be increasingly important for everyone to have those skills. So I think it's just forward thinking in those. But again, it all comes back down to having conversations about what's actually needed and making sure that we're continually doing that.